Okay, looks like we're live. So the time is now 2:03, so I will call this meeting to order. We'll start with the recognition of traditional territories. This land is on the land on which we meet today is the traditional territory of the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe peoples, many of whom continue to live and work here today. This territory is covered by the Upper Canada Treaties and is within the land protected by the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Agreement. Today, the gathering place is home to many First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples. Acknowledging this is a reminder that our great standard of living is directly related to the resources and friendship of Indigenous people. Do we have any amendments to the agenda? I'm not aware of any, or at least I don't have any to make. So seeing none, do you have a motion to approve the agenda? Andrew, okay, great. All in favor? All right, carries. So we don't have any minutes. This is the first meeting of the Designations Subcommittee, so we don't need to worry about that. Any declarations of interest today? Okay, seeing none, we'll move on to our first order of business, which is election of the chair and vice chair. I don't know if we need a vice chair for such a small committee, but maybe it doesn't hurt to have that as well. So are there any nominations for a chair? Andrew?
The designations are of particular interest to me, so I would be happy to take it on if nobody else is inclined.
Okay. Is anybody else? Okay, all in favor of Andrew being made the chair? And that passes. So Andrew, you are now the chair.
Thank you.
I'll pass things along to you so you can do the motion, I guess, for vice chair.
It may be, it would probably, as you said, we may not need it, but it might be a good idea just from the standpoint if someone needs to step in.
Yeah.
So if anyone would like to volunteer for that.
The silence is deafening.
Oh, Mark put his hand in.
I suppose I could try for vice chair. Nobody else wants to do it.
It might be a good idea because if you're pressed into service, you're used to running the meetings and so on, which was, I think, one of the main things the vice chair needs to do. So if you're comfortable with that, then I think that would be acceptable to everybody. I would be happy. So all in favor?
Okay, that passes. So Brian, you're the vice chair.
Okay.
So Andrew, unfortunately, I didn't make a script for us today for you, but essentially we'll just move right into 8.1,
Sure.
25 Henrietta.
Right. So, sorry, let me scroll through my thing here. Item 9.1, you said?
8.1, I believe it should be, or maybe it's 9.1 on yours.
Oh, it is 9.1 on here.
Yeah.
Which is 25 Henrietta, and there's been a lot of information distributed about that property. If anyone hasn't had time to look at it or has any questions, I think Brian put most of that together with the help of Gail, so he could probably speak to that if anyone has any questions.
Yeah, Brian, do you want to kind of summarize maybe some of the research that you found? I did a little bit of digging today as well, just to kind of see if there was any other kind of threads that I could tie up, but you did a lot. So
yeah, I mean, basically, I just did the some of the city directories, but most of it was land registry records about Henrietta. And I mean, it's a really cool piece of property because, I mean, when you consider that there's like 240 years of Euro-Canadian occupancy on that land, and it's only had like about 4 or 5 owners in that entire time, starting out as a Hainer farm in the early 1880s, mid 1880s. It becomes it was bought by the Walkinshaw family, who are really, based on the research Gail did, quite an interesting lot of people. I mean, prominent, socially prominent, musically inclined, writing music and what published music. And then because the Walkinshaws were intermarried with the Gorings, so you're getting all of this lovely associative history of early families, agriculture, the whole early history of St. Catharines. I mean, it's a wonderful bundle of everything. And then, you know, so it basically stays in the Walkinshaw-Goring family until 1962. I think by looking at the title, the abstract index, and the appearance of the house, I think the house probably is about a turn of the last century building. And it looks like it's in virtually pristine condition. I mean, I don't think it's been modified outside at all. You know, the window openings and everything look original, and I mean, it's an ideal candidate, in my opinion, for being listed.
So through the chair, the construction date we have on file from impact data is 1912, which when looking at it, I think that makes sense to me. It's kind of in that craftsman bungalow kind of era, like 1900 to 1930. It could be one of those houses that was, you know, from a Sears catalog with a little bit more kind of higher craftsmanship, perhaps, than what you might normally find. The other thing that I found today was looking up Stuart Walkinshaw. He actually was a lot bigger than just a local kind of musician. It turned out that he was actually part of kind of the early motion picture business in the US. And so there's a book that's in the Brock Library, which unfortunately I haven't been able to get to yet. But there's a book there that's basically talking about how he was a partner of Lyman H. Howe, which is a name that I did not know before this, but he has a Wikipedia page because he was that important at the time. So he was involved in kind of the early motion picture business and was involved in creating kind of sound effects for early motion pictures. And that's how Walkinshaw got involved, because Walkinshaw was a musician. And so I guess they came across each other, and then he asked Walkinshaw to join him for some of these motion pictures, and then they became a partnership. And I think it details it in even more kind of like the partnership grows and expands, and he becomes more of a partner instead of just kind of a session player with him over time. But I think a lot of that detail is in that book that I mentioned. And if we ever decided to designate the property, we could kind of dig in even deeper and find out more about it. But I think he seems to me to be the kind of key figure, especially since he was the one likely who built the house, it looks like, or at least the eras match up, right? So yeah, I thought that was really interesting.
Yeah, that is interesting. I didn't know that.
So I guess, so from a listing perspective, because of the changes to Bill 23, or stemming from Bill 23, we need to make sure that it meets at least one of the criteria of 906. And so I created a little rubric of 906 criteria. To me, and we can discuss this, but to me, it seems like a representative example of a craftsman bungalow. Craftsmanship, a high degree of craftsmanship, I think it's probably there. I don't know the building well enough to be able to know exactly what elements of it touch on that, but I think that's something that if we ever went to a designation, we could say, you know, there might be elements here that represent high craftsmanship. Does not, I think, demonstrate any sort of high degree of technical or scientific achievement. That would be pretty rare anyways. I think the historical value, I think there's a really strong link here to Walkinshaw and the Walkinshaw family. I think that's the one we should try to focus really strongly on, because there is that direct physical, tangible link there. And then we don't know the architect. I think it would be really interesting if we were able to find that out one day. And then contextual value, I don't know if it necessarily defines, maintains, and supports the character of the area. That street is kind of a mishmash of styles. But I do think that from a contextual value perspective, there's definitely a historical link to the surroundings, especially since Walkinshaw Park is right nearby. And so I think that you can make an argument that the house is connected in that way. And then I don't think this would be a landmark in any way, but I think we're meeting at least 2, if not 3 of the 9 criteria. And I think that's a safe bet to be able to say that, yeah, it merits listing.
Mm-hmm. Well, that was going to be my question for you, James. We haven't sort of talked process yet, but it seems like you're sort of walking us through the process. So it sounds like you agree that there is ample case in this situation to reach out to them about adding it to the register. And from my standpoint, I think you're right. There's certainly a lot of we're off to a good start, and I think it puts us in a position where we can then follow up on that and see how much more is there, because what we have is sort of the tip of the iceberg potentially. So it definitely bears further investigation.
Yeah, I think so. And I don't think the intention of listing a property is to do that intense amount of research that you would for a designation. But I think we have to show our work a little bit, right? And say why we're doing this. And,
Yeah.
and I think there's enough there to be able to say that and to reach out to the new owner and say, here's why we think it's important. Personally, I mean, it's such a nice building, but I think the Walkinshaw story is really fascinating as I started to kind of read a little bit more about it. I can't imagine there were that many people in St. Catharines that were that involved in the early days of kind of the entertainment industry in North America. So yeah, I think that it could be a fascinating story to tell. So yeah.
It would be interesting to know if Walkinshaw actually did any of his motion picture inventions or any of his work while he was living in that house. I mean, that would really make it an important structure.
Yeah, I was only able to pull out snippets of a book from Google, essentially. Like, it only lets you view certain pages, and then other ones it just gives you a snapshot that says they're mentioned. So there's I'll send around after our meeting today. I'll send around an email with the book title, and then if somebody wants to head down to Brock and look at it, by all means, you're welcome to. It's not in the St. Catharines Library. It's in the Toronto Reference Library, though, as well. I don't think it's a book that's super popular, obviously, but we do have it locally, at least. So I'll share that with everybody so we can take a look.
You have a question?
Holly?
Yeah, I just have a question. Also, that Henrietta Street, it has some significance to Ridley College, as the gates are at the bottom of the Henrietta Street. And I'm wondering if there was any significance for to Ridley College, if there's any association.
But there probably would be between the Walkinshaw family then and Ridley. That would be interesting to know for sure. And I think further research would turn that up. One thing I did note, I think I mentioned this at the other meeting, was in the fire insurance plan. It is one of the very first houses in that whole block. So it's early for that block, at least, as well. Anyone else?
Well, I know there's the house at 37 Henrietta, which is the former headmaster's house, if I'm not mistaken. And so we know there's a direct link to that house, at least.
Right.
I think that house would date after this one, unless we know for sure there was some sort of Walkinshaw Ridley connection. It doesn't seem like there would be based on the fact that there was a house built for the Ridley headmaster on that block. It seems like that's the house that has the connection to Ridley, but it's possible that there could be some earlier connection.
I just have another question. I used to volunteer a lot with the Ridley College Family Guild, and we used to have our meetings, and they had this big in the basement. It was called the Archives Room, and it was an old library. It was like super cool with all the old artifacts from Ridley College over the years. And Paul Lewis, he was from Yates Street, and he was one of their big historians there at Ridley College, and like, he knew the answers to everything. But they had just books and papers, and they've got the neatest archives room you've ever seen there. So you always think of registering these buildings, and you always wonder too if a lot of those buildings on the Ridley campus and site are classified as heritage.
It's interesting to know that they have an archive there. I wasn't aware of that. And, when it's not sort of a normal stop when you're researching, I wonder, how internal their scope is, or if there could be some interesting stuff in there about the surrounding area as well. Might be good to have a contact with the archive there to be able to reach out to from time to time.
I don't know if Paul Lewis is still alive. Did you ever know him, Brian?
I believe he's passed.
Oh, has he? And he wrote some books, and I don't know who's taken over that, but boy, they had a really an amazing collection of neat things there.
I think the archive that they had primarily relates to the college itself and past students and so on and faculty. But I think it also touched on the 8th Street neighborhood because, of course, that was where, Ridley started out its life. So it sort of spans both sides of the 12-mile creek. But I don't think it was, as in depth as, like, let's say the special collections room at the library or at Brock. But it's good for that Yates Street, Ontario Street, and current Ridley College site. So
yeah. So again, going back to process for a minute, James, our role here, just to be sure, our role that now in the case like this would be to, assuming the subcommittee wants to recommend this, we make the recommendation to the advisory committee as a whole, who will then make the formal, presumably sign off on that and make the formal recommendation. Yes.
Yeah, that's correct. So what we'll do is, assuming everybody's on board with that today, we'll make a motion today that recommends that the Heritage Committee consider it. And then I'll reach out to the owner, because that's part of our process, is making sure that the owner is involved and they're aware. And so I'll send out a letter to them and invite them to the meeting, or at least invite them to have a chat with myself. And we'll essentially bring this to the next Heritage Committee meeting, which is in 2 weeks. So assuming that we can get in touch with the owner properly, because it is a new owner, I'll have to make sure that we have that contact information, but I'll do my best to get in touch with them in advance. Because one of the questions sorry, Andrew.
Sorry, go ahead. No, go ahead.
I was going to say, one of the questions we would get from council potentially is, did you reach out to the owner? And so want to make sure that we do that, do our due diligence to make sure they're part of the conversation. So
okay. Would anyone like to make that motion then? Robert, would like to make that motion?
I would be pleased to make that motion and bring it forward to the full committee.
Do you want to draft language on that, James, or is
I don't have something written currently, but I think the motion would essentially be that the subcommittee recommends that 25 Henrietta be listed on the city's heritage register because it contains the following potential reasons for designation or reasons for listing. We would list then the representative of a craftsman bungalow, the relationship to Walkinshaw, and its historical contextual relationship to Walkinshaw Park. So I think that would be maybe our motion. I'll craft something up and make sure that it makes sense for the next meeting.
Just to bring you up to speed, Mark, you were gone for a moment. Robert has moved that we recommend that the Heritage Committee recommend the addition of 25 Henrietta to the register.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm for that.
All in favor? Okay, so that carries. The next item on the agenda is the Heritage Register, the designation priority rubric. Do you want to give us a bit of an overview on that, James?
Sure. So as part of our kind of reevaluation of all the properties that are currently on our Heritage Register, we'll need to prioritize those properties and figure out which ones we want to target for designation. As part of doing that, we obviously need a way to kind of score all of the properties. And just a reminder, we're only going to be looking at properties that are outside of the downtown core, outside of the boundary area of the proposed Downtown Heritage Conservation District. So we'll just be looking at properties outside of that, which leaves us with about 60 or so properties. So in coming up with kind of a new rubric, because I think it's important that we look at every property kind of with a fresh set of eyes, and make sure that, since some of these properties were added before 2009, they might have changed over time. And so I think it's important that we relook at them and reevaluate them and kind of measure apples to apples, right? And make sure that we're okay with the priority system that we've come up with. So I've kind of come up with a prioritization rubric, which is essentially based around Regulation 906, which is how we determine if a property merits designation. I passed it around to everybody earlier this week. I'm not sure if everybody had a chance to take a look at it. It's obviously, this is just a draft, and the point of our meeting today really is to kind of finalize how we want this to be used, or how we want things to be weighted, I guess you could say. And the point system can be a challenge because, as I mentioned in the email to everybody, sometimes you might have a property that is amazing in one criteria but has no doesn't meet any of the other criteria, right? And for that one reason alone, it might merit designation. And so we'll need to figure out how to find a balance there. I think it's also really important to remember that this is essentially a process to try to prioritize properties. And at the end of the day, we're going to have a list. And it's possible for us to, as a group say, you know what, this property is maybe rated too low, or this property is maybe rated too high. Let's move that around a little bit. So whatever we decide today isn't set in stone. It's not saying, nope, if a property gets, 40 out of 60 points and another property gets 39, that's, a huge difference, right? We might look at it and say, actually, that property that's at 39 out of 60 points is actually more important. So we can figure that out, but this is just kind of a process to get to that point, I guess. So what I've done and what I sent around to everybody was a rubric, and I'll put it up on the screen right now, because I think what we should do maybe is just talk about each criteria and talk about kind of how things are weighted and whether or not we think there needs to be more nuance or less nuance, or kind of figure out what our strategy is going to be going forward. So let me share my screen. So let me know when you can see that. Okay, so starting off with criteria 1, which is the property has design value or physical value because it is a rare, unique, representative, or early example of a style, type, expression, material, or construction method. I broke this down into the 4 different options that it can fall under, and obviously a property can fall under all of the options. But essentially we have either rare, unique, representative, or early. In my experience, when I've been working on doing 906 evaluations, to me, rare and unique are the most important, or at least the strongest of the 4. I think if you have something that's rare or unique, it's one of a kind. And at that point, that should immediately, have it rise to the top. Early obviously can be very important, but sometimes you end up with early buildings that, are just there because they've managed to somehow stand the test of time. It doesn't mean that they're necessarily significant, but they do have an age to them, right? So that's important, but maybe not as important as something that's rare and unique. And then representative to me is kind of the lowest kind of threshold. So a property then, if it's representative of type. There might be a lot of those other types in the city. And so representative to me has always been kind of the bare minimum that you'd want to see in this. And I think if something is just representative, it also has to be a very good example of it. So I've kind of assigned point values where 7 is the highest, and I've done this throughout in all the other criteria as well, mostly where 7 is kind of viewed as the peak, with 5 being early and 3 being representative. I'm not sure if anybody has any thoughts on that, but I think and by all means, there's no offense taken if you disagree vehemently with how this is done. We can definitely play with things today. So that's the point of this meeting.
One question when we talk about rare, unique, representative, et cetera, in what's the scope for that? For example, the Walkinshaw house, for let's say that's unique within its neighborhood, but on the other side of town, there are other examples like that. Are we evaluating the context of the city, or are we evaluating it in the context of its surroundings and how wide?
I think that's a really good question, because I think you can really make an argument that in the case of the Walkinshaw house, in that neighborhood, this is a really unique feature. And I think if that's the case, we can say that. I don't think there's any problem with that. I think that we have to be careful in terms of, because a lot of these properties I think are going to be falling in that realm potentially. And so we just have to make sure we're doing apples to apples. And maybe at the end of the day, when we come back to this, and we've all done our evaluations and we start realizing, too many properties went that route, or maybe not enough properties went there. We'll have to kind of figure out, okay, what's kind of been has there been a common kind of element throughout, right? And making sure that we're comfortable with how that's played out. But I definitely agree with you that we have to kind of think about it that way.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay.
But at the end of the day, I don't think there's a problem with that necessarily. I think if we feel strongly that something is unique and rare, but it has to be a larger context. It can't just say unique and rare on that street, right? It has to be, for that part of town or for that era or something like that, right? So.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, and that's it. You're right, because it may be something that's in the North End, then we go, well, it's the only one here, but this is a common downtown. Well, that's an interesting and significant feature of that building, but for St. Catharines, it may not be rare, but it's rare for the context it's in. So I don't know. That is a tricky one.
No, I think if we find that trends start to emerge like that, and because we're going to strictly be dealing with properties that are outside the downtown, I think this is something that could come up, multiple times, right? So I think as long as we're consistent, and if we, at the end of the day, in a few months from now when we're done this process and we look at all the properties, and if we see that, because we're going to go through this process and look at all the properties, right? And we're going to say, this is how this one scored and this is how this one scored, and it's probably going to come up where we're like, well, why did that one score this high and this one didn't? And maybe these kind of arguments will be fleshed out, right? And we can also, because the way that we're going to do this is I've created a Google form, which is just a survey essentially that you'll be able to fill out for every property. And it allows me to then organize things really easily. You can add comments. So you'll be able to say, I scored it a 7 because of this, and here's my rationale for it. So I'll be able to take that all in and say, okay, Andrew's been rating this property in this way or looked at it this way, but Holly looked at it this way. And then we can at least have that conversation and figure out which is most appropriate.
For sure. Does anyone else have any thoughts or questions on that section?
I mean, this is not going to be so much of an issue for a good part of the north end, because let's face it, when you get past Carlton Street down to the lakeshore, I mean, practically, all the heritage structures have sort of, been plowed over and turned into 1960s and 1970s subdivisions. So, a lot of this stuff, if we're talking about is a house unique or rare, it's going to be, have more significance when you start getting into places like, Port Dalhousie or Meriton, or the fringes of the downtown, say between Welland Avenue and Carlton Street, places where there are older buildings. But it is a good point, though, Andrew, that you raised.
Yeah. So, do you want to continue, James?
Yeah, sure. Question? So moving on to the next one, I think a high degree of craftsmanship and artistic merit, to me, is a yes or no question. Either it has it or it doesn't. I think high degree is setting the bar for us. So in this case, I think if it's a yes, and to be honest, like a lot of these listed properties, odds are they probably aren't going to have a high degree of, otherwise they probably would have already been designated. That's not to say that that's the case for all of them. There's certainly properties that have a high degree that are only listed, but I think for most of these, if it's going to have a high degree, I think that that's very important, and I think that should allow it to rise up to the top. So I've rated that as a 7, and then if it's a no, it's a 0.
That makes sense. I'm just scrolling down to see if there's other things we like that. One of the tricky things about that is when you encounter a building that's been heavily modified, whereas it may at one time have represented that, but how much has that been compromised by the modifications that have been made? And there's certainly, you see, if you look around, you see a lot of those where you see the ghost of what once was, but it's really been eradicated. And so I think we're talking largely about what remains. Am I correct? Or
I think so, unless we have evidence, photographic evidence that there was more to it, which we might have in some cases. I think because the goal here is to prioritize properties, I think that if there are properties that have a high degree and they currently have a high degree, I think those should be viewed as more important than ones that at some point in their history had a high degree. Because I think we want to make sure that those properties that are great right now kind of rise to the top and that they get the attention they deserve. So yeah, there's going to be a fair number of properties, I think, that, yeah, maybe at some point had a high degree of craftsmanship or artistic merit. But if it's not there now, and, I don't know if it's necessarily something we want to focus on or make a priority, I guess. Because the other element is we have to think about is that it's one thing to designate these properties, but there is a process where somebody can appeal it as well. So the homeowner could say, I don't want my property to be designated, and they could take us to the OLT. And so we have to make a very strong argument that this property merits designation for these reasons. And if it's something like, well, it used to have a really nice porch, whether or not that holds up at the OLT, you don't know, right?
Yeah.
So I think from a staff perspective, like I have to make sure that we're proposing properties for designation that make a lot of sense. Because if a lot of my time is tied up in OLT hearings, that's not great for us either, right? So, yeah.
But a lot of that's kind of next stage too. We're sort of at the point where we're trying to prioritize which one we consider for designation rather than,
So this is early days, but I just wanted to put that on everybody's radar as well. That's something that I have to be considering.
But
Mark?
it's also a reason to try to get our order right though too. So we are prioritizing the right ones and not prioritizing ones that have built-in problems like that are going to, we waste our time researching something that has too many hurdles to ever be designated.
Exactly. Yeah. And one of the questions that I'm going to have in our kind of questionnaire or survey is what's the architectural integrity of this building? So we'll be able to then score it. It'll be like out of 4 or 5 or something like that, where we'll be able to say, yep, the integrity is there, or nope, there's no integrity at all. And we can even weight that in some way down the road. Mark, I think you had your hand up.
Yeah, it was building on Andrew's comment of renovations, like covering up some craftsmanship, right? Like there was a condo on 4 Mile Creek Road in Niagara on the Lake, right in the heart of St. David's, and it was covered up with like siding, vinyl. I think it was vinyl siding for decades, and then they took it off, redid the brick, and it's such a beautiful building. Went in, it's built very well. So some of those kind of things, if you had the history, like photographs of each stage, then I don't know, then we would know. But if we're just looking at it right now, we might not see the craftsmanship when it's beautiful underneath of just a veneer.
Yeah, I agree. I think if we're able to find, if in those cases, hopefully, I don't know how obvious it will always be. It's not always obvious when something has been clad and what's underneath, but hopefully we would have evidence of that, or at least we'd be able to look at it and say, yeah, there's definitely more to this probably. And we can even flag that in our comments, right? Like it might not allow us to rate it as a 7 or a 0, like as a yes or no in this case, but we can at least say there might be something underneath.
Okay.
Yeah. So, but I think part of that might be, you might say, look, I found this amazing old photo of the building. Because of that, I think it's a 7. And we know it's under there somewhere probably. And so as long as we're showing our work, I guess, and can make a rationale for it, I think that's okay.
Okay.
Then there was one example like that in the last session. It was a building on St. Paul Street where there had been a facade put up in front of it, and just if you visited the site and looked at it, you could tell it was a fairly rough and thing built in front, and that it likely hadn't significantly compromised. You never know till you look at it, but that's different than if they stucco over brick, then it's going to be pretty hard to recover that.
Yeah, and I think also a property like on St. Paul is going to have probably photographic evidence for it, just because of where it's located. Whereas a property, I don't know, on Merritt or Moffat or something might not have it, right? Because it's just not an area that would have been maybe photographed as much early on. And so, yeah, we're at the whim of what we have available to us as well, I guess. Okay, so if there's no other questions about that, move on to the third one, which I would be very surprised if any of our properties demonstrate a high degree of technical or scientific achievement. To be honest, and I think over a decade of doing this, I've only had this happen to me once or twice. So I don't think this is going to happen, but just in case, view this the same as craftsmanship, where it's either a yes or no. I think 7 points for yes, 0 for no. I don't know if there are any concerns about that, but seems like probably the easiest one we can move on from. So then looking at historical value. So the property has historical value or associated value because it has direct associations with a theme, event, belief, person, activity, organization, or institution that is significant to a community. I think this one is really challenging because significance kind of is a real gray area, I think. And, you can make an argument for something being really significant to a community or really insignificant. It just depends on how you want to sort of spin it. So in this case, though, I have So excellent is 7 points. So it has a strong or rare link to the most significant parts of the city's history. Doesn't mean that it's the city's documented history. It could be, related to the city's Black history or something like that, right? Whereas maybe there's a history that we haven't tapped into, but if we think that it has a really strong or rare link to that history, then it qualifies there. And the reason why this one's 7 and then good is only 3 is to try to make sure that properties that are, top notch kind of get that extra bump up, right? So that's why there's that gap there. So to me, kind of a good here would be has a direct connection to an aspect of the city's history that may not be the most significant, but still helps to tell a story about the city or a specific neighborhood, community, etc. So it might be important to that specific area, or maybe it's important to a certain industry in the city, but it doesn't help tell, the whole story about the whole city, right? Fair, it has a limited connection to the history of the city or an element of its history. And then poor means no connection whatsoever. So this one, I think, when we get, once you actually start looking at properties, I think it'll be easier to compare and contrast, because kind of just in a hypothetical situation, it's hard to, grasp whether or not something should be an excellent or good. But I think once you have a set of properties in front of you and you start comparing them, it'll be easier for you to say, yeah, this one's good, this one's fair. Like, I think those types of things will emerge.
As you said, I think part of that's going to be at the end process when we look at them all together, making sure we're applying that evenly across the spectrum as much as anything else.
Well, and I think if anything pops up as a 7, it's, that to me, that's something that you have to have a very strong argument for, right? And so we're going to have conversations about that. I think if we see a property if somebody says this property is definitely a 7, and somebody else says, I don't know, I think it's a 1 or a 3, we'll have those conversations and we'll talk about why we think that is. And we'll figure that out.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the other thing is I want to make sure that we get multiple eyes on every property. So I don't want it to just be, each of us take a dozen and then that's it. Like, I'd like for there to be some overlaps. So that way we can say, well, Andrew thought, this about this property and Holly thought that about this property. And then we can kind of compare them and make sure that we're, on the same page. Right. So, and I'll be looking at them as well. So hopefully we'll have at least 3 sets of eyes on most properties in the city, which I think is really good.
Yeah, I thought that was a great idea.
Does anybody else have any thoughts on this section? Okay. So then we have another yes, no. So this is the property has historical value or associative value because it yields or has the potential to yield information that contributes to an understanding of the community or culture. This is a really challenging one typically because it's the way that the Ontario Heritage Act has kind of evolved over time and the 906 evaluation has evolved over time. This typically ends up being deals with archaeology and kind of like an unknown history that might not be relevant to the built form, I guess. It certainly can involve kind of histories that haven't been delved into, which is kind of, in St. Catharines in particular, there might be elements of our Black history that, haven't fully been explored. And maybe we can say, we think that this building might help explain that. And that's where the potential to yield information comes from. But it's something that typically, from my experience, has been more of an archaeology kind of criteria. But I think if we do find a property that's a yes for this, we can talk about that and kind of figure out, okay, does this make sense as it falling under this category or under this category, right? Because I think there's a chance that, something might yield information, but it also fits really strongly in here too. So I don't know if there's any questions about that one. This one's probably the hardest to understand because we don't know always if there's archaeological significance, right? So, or at least we don't know from other than, we have the regional archaeological mapping plan, and that identifies areas of potential archaeological significance. But just because it's highlighted on a map, it's highlighted because it's within a certain proximity of something, a waterway or a main kind of route through the city. It doesn't mean that there's definitely archaeology there. So it's a challenge.
Yeah, I mean, I was just going to ask about that because with something like, Henrietta Street, because it's that close to the 12 Mile Creek, in theory, there should be archaeology there because it's that close to a watershed. So if we're looking, let's say if we're evaluating Henrietta Street, should we be giving it a yes right away because of by virtue of the location of it? Or should we say, no, we don't know, even though it's within that 1,500 meter or 500 meter, whatever the buffer zone is?
My
Yeah, I
hunch,
mean,
having done like evaluations when I was on the private side, when I was at ASI, typically, even if we knew that there was a waterway nearby, we would put no here. It was only unless we had something that was really kind of tangible that we could say, yep, we think that there's more to it here. But just falling within that kind of buffer zone wasn't enough for us to usually say yes to it. But I think if we feel extremely strongly about it, sure. Like if there's a property where you're like, yeah, I think there definitely is, an indigenous link here, or something else, some other part of the story that a property potentially has the opportunity to yield some information from. I think you can make the argument if you want to, but I think at the same time, we might have to, at the end of the day, come back to it and say, okay, is it actually there or not? Or do we feel strongly enough about it to keep it as at that level?
could you not have a yes,
Maybe.
no, or maybe?
We could add
Like
a maybe.
yes 5, maybe 3, no 0, and then that way you're hedging your bets.
We could, yeah. The maybe, I think we'd have to make sure that we feel good about it still. Like there has to be some rationale for the maybe, I guess. Because otherwise maybe too many properties become a maybe just because of their location, because we have canals going through the city and stuff like that. But yeah, I have no problem adding maybe if that makes it easier for us. So
it might be good just to have a sheet of that criteria to look at, because in this case with the Henrietta one, I think it may be a little more removed, but when you look down along Hayner Street and things that are closer to it, it's not just the proximity to the waterway, it's the proximity to St. Paul Street, which was the Iroquois Trail, and the identification of significant archaeological things with the project at the Chickaluna Shipyard and so on. I think once you get a little closer to that juxtaposition, you have a much stronger argument to make in that case than maybe you do for Henrietta Street, which isn't far, but it's not right in the thick of it.
yeah, I would agree.
And then when you start looking at things like Henrietta Street, because it was on Hayner's Hill, I've seen references in the War of 1812 that there was a little shootout between a couple of Lincoln militiamen and a couple of American soldiers who had ridden into town to show those Brits what's what, and that was over on in that vicinity. So there could be some lead bullets or something that someone may unearth someday from 1812. So you just never know about a site.
Yeah.
So that's why I'm feeling more comfortable with having a maybe included.
Sure. Yeah, I think that's okay. I think if we get to the point where we are, say, designating a property and we've put maybe for this, I don't think it would hold up very strong to be able to say, yep, this definitely yields information because of a story we heard about the War of 1812, let's say, just because we don't have any sort of definitive kind of proof of that, right? So I think at that point we'd have to figure that out. But as part of this project, just trying to prioritize properties, I don't think it hurts. So okay. So moving on then. So this one talks about historical or associative value because it demonstrates, reflects the work or ideas of an architect, artist, builder, designer, or theorist who is significant to a community. So for this one, we have excellent, which is the person is very significant to the community and the property is a good example of their work. Good, the person has some significance or the property is not a good example of a very significant person's work. And poor, there is no significant person identified. So I only have 3 criteria here, or 3 options rather than 4. To me, I was trying to figure out how another one might fit in there, but it just seemed like, kind of like a green light, yellow light, red light scenario to me. So, and likewise, 7 points for excellent, 3 for good, 0 for poor, and the 7 is there to make sure that if a property is, you know, associated with a very significant person, that it gets that kind of bonus. And I actually have a feeling for a lot of our properties, we're going to actually have trouble figuring this out, because a lot of them we probably wouldn't know the owner or know the builder. It might have just been the person who lived there, which likely wasn't significant. But if there are properties that we have that you feel like, okay, there's something more to this, maybe I can do a little bit of digging to see if I can figure out the builder or the designer, by all means, you're welcome to do that. That's not, you know, especially if it's a property that you feel strongly about, you think that there might be something more there. Yeah, by all means, if you can, you know, try to do a little bit of research. It doesn't hurt. Does anybody have questions about that one or any comments about it?
Okay, so let's say we have a house that maybe, you know, something on Yates Street, for instance, and it's a really nice looking house. We suspect that it wasn't just something that the owner sat down and doodled something on the back of a matchbook and you know, came up with a design. And if we suspect that it might be built by someone like Isaac Parnell or Godfrey Wad, would that be the time that we could maybe say good, and then say we think it could be, or would that still have to be a 0 because we just don't know?
I think there's part of me that says, yeah, unfortunately it might be a 0, but I think there's also part of me that says that if you have some sort of hunch about it, hopefully that's based on something, right? So it's based on some sort of information that you know or have seen somewhere. And so I think if we can find what that information is, that kind of produce that in a way that says, okay, it's a good because of that, because we've rationalized it in this way. I think that's okay. But I do think the point of this one, though, is to say, yep, this reflects, you know, it's a really nice building and it reflects the work of such and such. If it's just a really nice building and we don't know who it's connected to, then it's technically covered in these 2 criteria, right? So that's just about architecture and about the quality of it. And then this is specifically about, you know, who did it, right? So yeah, I think if we have a hunch about a property, and also, I mean, the properties we're dealing with aren't ones in Yates, right? Where they're these really super ornate buildings. So we're going to be dealing with a lot of properties where it's kind of more like working class properties, which may not, you know, we might not have that hunch that we would have otherwise, right? So
maybe if we can have on the form an area for notes where things like that, we can make a note of it and say,
yeah,
because of style and location, I suspect this may be so and so. Then this thing we can factor in when we prioritize them later and consider it.
Yeah, well, and I think too, as everybody starts doing this work, and if you see a property like that, like share it with the group, right? And say, you know, send out an email to people and say, you know, I've seen this building. Does anybody else know anything about it, right? Because you know, between everybody, we might have an idea of, you know, who might have built something. You know, we don't. The odds might be slim, but you never know what you're going to come across or what's in people's buried in people's minds, right? So I would really suggest that everybody kind of, you know, chat with each other as well as you're working through these, because I think then everybody will be on the same page a lot more. Okay.
Question?
Yeah, go ahead, Holly.
I have a lot of friends that live on Yates Street right now. They have beautiful homes, and some of there's some really interesting garages and barns in behind some kind of coach house barns in behind their homes too, that are very old and very unique. Like, would any of this qualify ever?
So we're only looking at, as part of this project, the properties that are on the register. So if there is a property that's on the register that has an outbuilding like that, then yep, include it in your evaluation, because that might be important. If you do find an old property that has a barn, then that's representative of, you know, historical agricultural kind of property, right? So, or if there is an old coach house, that tells a story as well, right? So yeah, if you do come across any properties like that, consider the whole property, not just the building that you're looking at, because there's more to it than just, yeah, that one main building. Okay, so we'll move on to contextual value. To me, contextual value is kind of I would say sometimes can be the easiest to meet the criteria for, because everything's contextual. Once you build a building and place it somewhere, that's now contextual to that area, so it can be very easy to meet this criteria, I think. So what I've done is I've looked at for this one is it's important because it defines, maintains, or supports the character of the area. And to me, that's kind of a hierarchy, or at least in terms of how I view it. Define being the most important. It's very important part of the character of the area. If it was removed, the character of the area would be changed significantly. Maintain just means that it's part of a main group of buildings, or it's part of a kind of grouping that together make up the character of the area, but it's not singularly important. So for example, St. Paul Street might be one of the best examples, where if you remove one of those buildings, St. Paul Street's still St. Paul Street, but it's still that building that's there, that's part of that main street wall, helps to maintain that, right? And then support. So it's part of an area of a similar character, or with a similar character, but it's not part of the main group of buildings, nor is it the most important building. So for example, a building on St. Paul Street, maybe it's not part of that street wall, but it's still part of the main street, right? So it helps provide context in that sense. So to me, the way that I've ranked them is define as 5, maintain as 3, and support as 1. The reason why I have define only as 5 is because to me, that's a really important building. That would be a building that's essentially a landmark. And so later on, we have landmark as a criteria. And that one I've actually bumped up to 10, because I think if a building is a landmark, that's a building everybody knows and is super important. So you're kind of making up for it here. That was my rationale, at least, for doing that. And also because I find contextual value to be the easiest to sort of meet. I feel like most of these buildings probably have some contextual value, but our goal is to try to find the ones that rise to the top a little bit. And so I didn't want, this necessarily to rank the same as something with high craftsmanship, even though, contextual value still can be very important.
That's a bit of a sticky one, the difference between define and maintain, because even if it defines it, it depends on the buildings around it too. Yeah. For you to be able to say it defines it. So are you saying that one that you would say defines it is one that it really is maintained, plus it has an additional significance in its own right? I
think so, yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
Does that make sense to do it that way?
Yeah. I think that's really the only way to separate between the two, unless you say this was the first one and the rest are modeled after or whatever, but that's very problematic in and of itself.
Yeah. No, it's definitely a challenge. And I think this isn't going to be perfect. I hope that it gets us to a point where we're like really happy with the list that we've come up with. But if we are finding that, something's not working right, we're going to have another discussion about this, at another meeting, right? And so we can bring up properties where we say, I was looking at this property, I don't know how I feel about it. I ranked it this, what does everybody else think? And then at least we can make sure that everybody's looking at properties in the same way. Because it's important that we work together on this and not just view it as, oh, I'm evaluating these properties in kind of my own little silo. We're all kind of doing this together, I think. So moving on to the next contextual value one. So property has contextual value because it is physically, functionally, visually, or historically linked to its surroundings. What I've done for this one is because a property can meet all 4 of those things, I think you should get a point for each one that you meet. So if a property does have a historical link, you get 1 point. If a property has a visual link, you get 1 point. If it has multiple, great, you accumulate those points. If it meets all 4, we give it a bonus point to get it up to 5. I think this is really challenging because a property could have a really strong physical link, right? And that physical link could be so strong that it should merit more than 1 point. But I'm not entirely sure how to craft this criteria in a way that would make sense where a property doesn't accumulate too many points too easily, just because, you know, it's able to hit on so many of these. So I don't know if anybody has any thoughts on that, but I thought this might be the best way to do it.
I've got a question.
Yeah, go ahead, Mark.
It seems like some of these are very similar to number 7. Like
Yeah.
if it's visually linked and defines or maintains like contextual value. If I'm getting that right here.
Yeah, they are very similar. You're typically going to find if you meet some of the criteria here in 7, you're probably going to meet some of the criteria in 8 as well. So they kind of piggyback on each other.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's why I say that contextual value is kind of the easiest one to meet, because it's all of a sudden it's easy to get, you know, you can meet the criteria of 7, and if you're going to meet the criteria of 7, you probably meet the criteria of 8, and now all of a sudden you have a property that can be designated, right? And so,
Right.
yeah, so it is challenging, but at the same time, that's the criteria that we've been given by the province. So that's kind of what we have to work with.
I guess it makes sense with the lower value of it too, then, of each one.
Yeah, because I think if a property is contextual because it's physically, functionally, visually, historically, like because for all those reasons, that means it's an extremely important contextual building, right? Like it's going to build up those points, and because of that, you know, it's going to do well in that ranking. So that to me was the reason why I thought it made sense to just add them up and give them 1 point for each. If we thought that it deserved 1.5 points, we could talk about that now, or 2 points, or whatever that number is. I'm not sure. It was just me kind of throwing something out there for the group, and to me, this is kind of where it made the most sense. But
yeah, breaking it down, I think that makes sense. Yeah.
And there is the potential for it to be highly weighted if you have one that under number 7 defines the area, and then it checks all of those boxes. I mean, it could receive 10 points, which is the same as being a landmark. So even though the numbers are individual, collectively, there's a lot of weight there for something that checks all the boxes.
and to me, oh, sorry, go ahead, Brian.
I'm just wondering, like, really, what's the difference between being physically linked and functionally linked? I mean, they're almost sort of the same thing, aren't they?
You think you could probably make a good case for that? Yeah. I don't know, when they created Regulation 906 20 years ago, I don't know exactly what they were thinking in terms of differentiating those. My guess is that physical is kind of just a visual, like it physically appears to be linked to the area, whereas function is like it has some sort of use that then is contributing to the area.
Like the train station.
Yes, there you go. That exactly, yeah. That would be a perfect example. So it would be both physically linked because it's related to the train station, but it's also it's functioned in a way that supported all that area, or the rail line and all that area. So, and then you can make an argument. It's like, well, what's the difference between physically and visually, right? So that's why I say it's easy to kind of, the only one that's really distinct is historically. But at the same time, you can say, you know, well, this building's been here for 120 years. Without it, it's, you know, that connection is historical, right? And without that building, that link is severed, right? So yeah, it's probably one of the more, I won't say problematic, but it's probably one of the more challenging criteria to deal with from when it comes to the 906 evaluation. So, but hopefully at the same time, I think a lot of properties hopefully will meet all the other criteria will come out. And so, you know, hopefully we're only, if there are differences in here, you're talking about 1 or 2 points here and there, and it won't make a huge difference. And at the end of the day, we'll look at those properties and compare them, right? And say, okay, well, you know, this one got to this point because of these reasons, right? We came to this point total because of X, Y, Z, and you know that's different from how we got to the point total for this other one, and we think that the way that the first one was done was you know, more significant, right? So yeah, we'll kind of play with it as we go along, I think. And then finally, last one was property has contextual value because it is a landmark. So this one I have, yes, it's 10, no is 0. I think if it's yes for this, it's probably going to meet a lot of the other criteria in a really high way. But I think that, having making sure that we're tackling our landmarks is really important. So that's why I rated it as highly as I have.
Can you define a little bit for us what you would consider to be a landmark? Because that would be fairly rare, I would think.
Yeah, I think so. I think to me, a landmark is a property that either, everyone knows. Landmark is almost like it when you see it, right? Or everybody knows that building. It's in a location that's really prominent. It's a building that's really important to the community, or a community. So it could be, one of the churches on Church Street, right? Is a landmark for that community because that was the most important church historically for, that religion, right? So those types of things. So basically, it's level of importance almost is landmark status, because I think most of the most important buildings in the city probably are a landmark, right? If somebody said St. Catharines Club, everybody knows what the St. Catharines Club is, right? So I think it's one of those when you see it. Okay, so if we add up all of those points, the most you can get is 60, which seems like a round number that makes sense to me. Some additional criteria that I wanted to consider, things like building and architectural integrity. Right now on our survey, I have it out of 5, where 5 being, this is a building with great architectural integrity, and 1 being it has little to no architectural integrity. I think what we might end up doing is, instead of factoring that into the rubric, what we'll do is at the end, when we start going through all the properties, that might be, a tiebreaker. It might be one of those things that we look at and say, okay, these 2 properties both are, scoring this score or roughly around the same score. What's the integrity of them? And then we'll talk about that and use that potentially as a tie-breaking kind of element. And then, is a building at risk? So it could be at risk for any number of reasons. That's kind of a yes or no. And I think if we feel that a building is at risk, I think that's something that we'd want to make sure that we took care of and was rising to the top of our list. And then, is it part of a planning application? So I'm going to have properties that come in occasionally that are part of planning applications, and we're going to have to make sure that those are factored in. And so those would have to potentially rise to the top because we need to make sure that they're designated as part of a planning application. So I don't know if these would necessarily need to be points or anything like that. I think it's just extra things to consider, and things that we'll consider when we get to the point that we've accumulated all of our data and we look at our final list. And maybe at the end of the day, I'll be proposing potentially a list to everybody. I'm not sure if that's how it's going to work, where I'll say, okay, these are the point totals that came in, and I've also bumped up these other properties for these other reasons. We can discuss them at that time. Does anybody have any thoughts or comments, or are there any other criteria that you think that we should maybe add? Robert?
I see that the point total is 60. We did alter a couple of points early on, so that number will have to be changed. I don't know, is it obviously the numbers are somewhat arbitrary, but as long as we're all singing from the same hymn book, I think it should be fine. But that will have to be altered a little bit. The maximum number, the total number.
So the maximum number, so the one that we added was this maybe to number 5, right, which is
so
only 3 points. So the 60 is the maximum score. It's not the cumulative. It's not all the scores added up. It's if you got the max score in every criteria, you would get 60. So in this case, the max score you could get in criteria 5 is 5 points already. So even if you scored a 3, that wouldn't change the maximum that you could get.
Okay, so fair enough.
Yeah. And then, sorry, go ahead, Ryan.
Are we considering anything about, like, if the property has like gigantic mature trees and things on it, like the landscape, is that coming into the some of these ones that has the contextual value?
So typically, so we're looking at cultural heritage value. And so those trees, and I'm thinking about typically when I've included trees in designations elsewhere, like when I was working as a private consultant, it's that those trees were things like on a rural property, defining the property boundary, right? Because those trees would separate one farm from another. And so that's why that would be important. Or it'd be, let's say, a row of trees going up a rural driveway, right? Because that would be a really important part of that setting. So I think we'd have to make sure that if there were any trees that were on a property that we felt had cultural heritage value, or we'd have to make sure that we felt that those trees had cultural heritage value, because it would have to contribute to one of these criteria. So because when we write the designation report, let's say we designated some of these properties, we write the designation report and wanted to include a tree, that tree has to link back to the evaluation and what's in the statement of significance. So we'd have to have a rationale for why that tree is included.
So if it's like the maple tree that inspired the Maple Leaf Forever anthem, then we'd take that into consideration. Okay.
Yeah, so that would be under historical value, I guess, right? So we can say that tree is associated with, I guess the Maple Leaf Forever song is an event or a, I'm not really sure which one it would fall under, but activity maybe. But at least there's an association there, right? That we would be able to point to, and this is where we would usually point to that.
Yeah. So I just know if we had to, consider, the physical landscape surroundings, like say something like Rodman Hall, where you've got, the house itself, which is, super important, but then, so are the grounds and the gardens around it.
Yeah, and I think you can make an argument for that based on the history of the house and why the gardens are there, right? So at least it's linked to, that history of that property in a very tangible way. Whereas if it's just a tree that never got cut down and was just has always been there, it might be harder to, make the argument. Are there any other criteria that you think that we should include?
I've got a question about going back to trees.
Sure.
If it was a landmark, if the tree itself on that property was a landmark, would that go under historical significance, or would it be under the landmark?
I don't know if I know of any trees that are landmark. Maybe the Maple Leaf Forever tree might have been a landmark. I'm not sure, but are there trees in the city that you think would be a landmark tree? I don't know.
There's an Indian marker tree potentially in the Hofstadter Cemetery. There might be others.
Yeah, I think I'd want to be careful about it. If that situation comes up, I think it's worth talking about. But at the same time, trees unfortunately die sometimes, and so we have to kind of I think we would just be careful about how we, because we don't have a designated tree, like an inventory or anything like that. And there's no tree bylaw to be able to deal with that type of situation. So
wasn't there at one point a directory of historic trees or something for St. Catharines? I remember something about that.
I don't know anything. I know it's been brought up by the Heritage Committee before, and I've never found anything that, at least in our server, and I've gone back.
Isn't there a plaque in City Hall when you're coming down the stairs that has some heritage trees listed on it?
Yeah, that's what I'm referring to, I think.
You're coming in from James Street. It's on the right-hand side.
Yeah.
You would think that the gardeners and people from Parks and Rec would know where all the big 200-year-old black walnut trees are throughout the city.
Yeah, I imagine they definitely have that inventory. I just don't know if we don't have any sort of formal, from a heritage perspective, at least, anything that says these are the, culturally significant trees in the city. At least nothing that I've seen. Yeah, it might be something that we had at some point and it didn't get carried over, which I've found has happened over time, where there were properties that were on their inventory kind of in the 90s, I guess, or the things that were tackled in the 90s that then in the late kind of 2008, 2009 era kind of fell off. And so I'm wondering if maybe we had something that was, 20 years ago in place that we just don't have today, and I'm just not aware of it. But I can do a little bit more digging and see if I find anything, or maybe our archives might have something.
That was my impression, was that it was something that had sort of tailed off at some point, that it had been sort of the information had been collected. But if I recall the conversation we had about, this was years ago, was that there was no formal provision to protect them anyway, so it was inherently informal to begin with.
Yeah, that sounds right to me.
Yeah.
If there was one, that would be the challenge. Would be how do you deal with that? Unless you designated the property and it's an attribute,
Mhm.
we don't have a lot of ways to deal with those types of things. So,
Mhm.
but if you do find when you're out there and there's a tree that you're like, this is culturally significant, bring it up and we'll talk about it at that time, because if we feel that tree is significant enough that this property merits some recognition, then it's worth talking about for sure.
Mhm.
Like in Port Duluth, those big ones that were on Main Street that got cut down by across the street from the cemetery on Port Duluth, those big ones in front of that home. Remember that one, Brian? And I think that's the
333 Main.
Yes.
Yeah.
There's some big trees in Port Duluth.
Yeah, it's definitely, there's lots of great trees. It's kind of from a perspective, okay, what's the cultural heritage value of them, right? So you have to find some sort of reason why they're significant to that property, and it's not just that they're big great trees, because there's a lot of them, right? And so from a regulation 906 perspective, unfortunately we have to tie it back to, okay, what's the significance of them? So I always try to bring it back to that, right? Because we have to make an argument for that at some point.
I think the city of Toronto designated some trees too, didn't they?
Yeah.
Yeah, they have a few that they've designated. I think the maple leaf, isn't the maple leaf forever tree a Toronto tree? It was, but it's
been cut down.
Yeah, it cut down. I think it was dying or died, maybe. And
it died.
Yeah, which is the problem with trees and having
years ago, when Kevin Blazowski was still our planner, we did, John Bacher and I and a couple of other people on the Heritage Committee at the time, we did start to do an inventory of some of the significant bigger trees in the city as we came across them. So that file might still be buried way deep somewhere.
Yeah, it's tough when he's 3 heritage planners removed from me, so some of that stuff gets lost, unfortunately, just from institutional knowledge. So I'll do some digging on my end. I've done it before in the past and didn't come up with anything, but I'll see what I can do, and if I find something, great, and if it's useful, then I'll share it with the group.
The example to me that always comes to mind when we talk about trees in this context is the comfort maple in Pelham, and I just quickly looked that up while we were talking, and it's there's a notation here saying that it was designated a heritage tree in June 2000 under the Ontario Heritage Act.
Great.
So apparently there is some provision for that in the Ontario Heritage Act. I wasn't familiar with it, but maybe something, if it's of interest and importance to us, we can look into that and see if there is provision for that. And
you can definitely designate trees. It's not necessarily a problem as long as you have a good reason for it. Like as long as you can make the argument from an Ontario 906 regulation 906 perspective. And I've included trees in designation bylaws or like statements of significance in the past, especially for, as I mentioned, for rural properties, where things like hedgerows are really important. Defining property boundaries and defining driveways and stuff like that. So I've included them before. It's a rare thing to do, only because it's, trees can die at any given point, and trying to, implement bylaws, if we don't have a tree protection bylaw, that can be really challenging, right? So, I will look into it though, and see what I can find, and I'll come back to the group with it. It might be actually something that I come back to the entire Heritage Committee with, because I think it's something that probably everybody would be interested in, because I know it's been brought up in the past.
Two other, I think two other trees that are significant in the downtown. There's a couple of big ginkgo trees in front of the courthouse across from City Hall. And the design of that building, I understand they had to modify it because when they demolished the library, they left those ginkgo trees standing. And they sort of had to rejig their plan a little bit to leave the trees standing, and so that they wouldn't be adversely impacted by the courthouse construction. So there are, you know, some significant trees in the city, but enough said about that.
Yeah, I'm just looking, as you were speaking, I was going through our server and kind of looking. So Chloe definitely did some looked into a heritage tree program. There's a lot of emails for me to go through, just to see what she did and how far she got. Because I think this is the question. I know even in the time that I've been at the city, it's been brought up at least twice, I think, and this is maybe the third time where we've talked about kind of heritage trees. And so I imagine that Chloe also had those questions before. So yeah, let me see what I find, and then I'll come back to the larger heritage committee, and kind of give a little bit of an update about what I find when I find it.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so, and I think in the meantime, if anybody does come across any trees with any of these properties, you know, bring them up to the group. Or flag this and say, you know what, there's some trees here that I think, you know, merit looking at as well. And we'll kind of go from there. Yeah, so I don't know, are there any other kind of larger kind of thoughts about the rubric? Are we on the right page? Are we on the right track, do you think? Does this seem like something that, you know, should work well for us?
Seeing we've got this rubric that we're talking about, would it be worthwhile for us to maybe take a property like 25 Henrietta Street and just go through this survey, these questions, and see, does it work?
Yeah. And
then, you know, that way, you know, when we come back to talk about Henrietta Street with the committee as a whole, you know, we might all have these lovely sheets with a score on it saying, look, the majority of the subcommittee, you know, everybody ranked it as a 60 out of 60, or whatever our score might be. And just as a way of testing to see if this works.
Yeah, I think that would be a great idea. I think what we could do is, so after our meeting today, early next week, I'm going to send around the copy of the survey to everybody. So you can you'll have the survey in front of you then. And maybe what we can do is, in preparation for the meeting that we'll have in a month from now, because the next meeting that we have, we're going to look at I'm going to go over what all the properties are for everybody, so we can make sure that we have them all. And then we can look at everybody can evaluate this property on Henrietta, and we can have a conversation about where our totals ended up when we get to the next meeting. So that could be kind of everybody's homework, I guess, is to do an evaluation of that one property, see what your total is, and we can discuss, you know, hopefully we're all roughly in the same kind of area when it comes to our point totals, but you know, one person might rate it 50 and another person might say 20 for some reason. It would be great to have that conversation and figure out how we got to that point, right? So no, I think that'd be great if everybody doesn't mind having a bit of homework this month.
That would be a useful exercise, I think, because if we did a test run and, you know, for example, if I rated something at 25 and everyone else was at 50, I would sort of want to look at that and go, okay, maybe I got to adjust my own expectations a little bit.
Yeah.
So we can sync up a little better, you know?
Yeah. Well, and I think what might end up happening is we're all different. We all come at things from a different perspective, right? And so somebody might find that all of their ratings are a little high, or somebody might find that all their ratings are a little low. And it's just because we have a different perspective, or maybe the group of buildings that you looked at, you know, one building might have been the best of that batch, but when you compare it to a batch that another person had, maybe it was like a middle of the road kind of building, right? So it'd be important for us to figure out, okay, you know, how is this working for everybody? And no, I think this is a really good exercise, and we have time. You know, I know we want to really get to it. I think doing it right and making sure that everybody's kind of on the same page is really important. So yeah, so I think if we target next meeting to do that task, we'll all be in good shape. And then in, I guess, October, November, we'll do our evaluations, and hopefully by the end of this year, we'll have a tangible list that we're happy to tackle from a designation point of view.
Mm-hmm.
And if things, like I said in the email, if things move quicker, great. You know, if everybody's getting through their properties really quickly and we were able to bump it up to November, fantastic. That's not a problem. So.
Mm-hmm. There was one thing I wanted to raise, and I'm going to apologize in advance for even raising it because I know nobody wants to hear this, but I know the focus is on the properties that are already on the register and so on. But I do think it's important that as we look around and look at these, that we try to be aware of buildings that may not be on the registry yet, but should be. And I'm not saying everything that's registry worthy should be put on, but I think we should at least have our eyes out for something that may represent a significant oversight and consider making a secondary task of anything that is a dramatic oversight, that we do consider adding it to the registry as well and feeding it into this process. If we go from 60 to 120 properties, we've done it wrong. But if we add 5 or 6 really significant ones that have been missed in the past, I think that's probably a good thing.
Yeah, I think my concern about that is we have so many nice properties that are not on our register, right? And so it would be really easy for that number to just get really big. And we have to remind ourselves that because of the changes to Bill 20, because of Bill 23, if we list something and add it to the register, we then only have 2 years, right? So we're kind of saying if we're listing it, we feel really strongly, yep, that one's going to be part of the list or part of the properties that will be designated, right? If we feel okay with waiting to add those, till after this process is done, after 2025, let's say, if it's a property we don't feel is at risk, we can always designate those afterwards, right? There's nothing that says we can't do that. So.
And I think in most cases, waiting would be okay. And when I say that, I'm thinking about one property in particular that's been on the market for a while now, and it has, I believe, an 1850s, 1860s house on it that's has a lot of its character intact, but it's being marketed as a development property. And all the sketches you see on the listing, the house is clearly anticipated to be demolished, and I think it's one that deserves to look, and it's, in my mind, definitely at risk. So that's the kind of thing I think about when I say this. I think there are plenty of other cases where if it's a well cared for home that someone is living in and taking care of, then there isn't, even if it is significant, there isn't the same push.
Yeah. No, that makes complete sense.
So in that case, how would you like to handle that? Is that something we should sort of send to you individually and let you take a look at it, or? Yeah,
I think that's probably best. And we can, if there are properties that could be development sites, or because the other thing, the conversation we had last month or at the last Heritage Committee meeting was about weaponizing heritage, right? And we want to make sure that we're not doing that. So I think we want to it's a delicate conversation that we might have to have with homeowners in those situations. So yeah, so bring it to me, and then we'll figure it out on our end, or when I say our, it's mine and Margaret's and Tammy's end, and figure out what the best path forward is for those properties. Because if there is an imminent risk and we feel that there's an opportunity where the owner is open to, heritage protection, and we'll have those conversations, right? So.
Yeah. And the example I give is one of those problematic examples because somebody has spent money on architects and other things and so on. But and I am sensitive to that, but I also think being thoughtful about what, when we do get out of the way and when we don't is I mean, if there'd been an oversight and Rodman Hall had never been looked at and, demolition permit went through quickly, that would have been a case where we should have stepped up, and other cases where we could say, okay, well, it's unfortunate, but this is mistakes of a past day, and we move forward. We're still going to lose some good buildings. We know that. But.
Yeah, it's part of, unfortunately, being in this field. But it's I feel good about the process that we have potentially in place here. And I think with the Downtown Heritage District, we're going to be starting the RFP for that very soon. releasing that to get some consultants on board. Between all of this, I think we're going to be in a much better place than we were even this time last year. So yeah, there's going to be properties that fall through the cracks, but in the grand scheme of things, I think we're going to be in a much better place from a heritage perspective. In a year and a half from now.
Just was I correct when you said that you counted 60 that were on the registry that were outside of the downtown bound, presumed downtown bound?
I have to confirm that number. It's roughly 60. It might be anywhere from 58 to 63, but it's around 60. So I'll confirm that for everybody though when I give everybody, because I'll have the finalized list for our meeting next week or next month. I mean, and it'll have a definitive number on there for sure.
Okay.
So yeah.
I'm just thinking about what works out to it. If everybody looks at 2, then we're talking about 24, 25 properties each between now and the end of the year, which it should be doable.
I think so. I'm also mindful that you are all volunteers, so I don't want to put like too much work on you as well. But I think 20 to 25 properties I think is okay. I don't think we're going to be doing intensive research about every property. If there are properties that you feel specifically strong about, by all means, do that extra little bit of legwork. Go to the library and see what they have in special collections, or talk to the archives. If there is a property that you want to dig into and you think there might be something at the archives, either get in touch with me and I can forward your concern over to Kathleen at the archives, and we can have people help do some digging for you. Or you can just reach out to them directly. They know that we're doing this work, and so they're more than happy to help. They've been really helpful in everything that I've ever asked them about. So.
I
Okay.
tend to get interested in over research, so I'm going to have to be very careful.
Well, yeah, it's a time thing, right? So it's really easy, I find, to go down a rabbit hole if you're not careful. So yeah.
Save the rabbit holes for next year when we're looking at designations.
Yeah,
Try
exactly.
to stay out of them for now. Yeah, I agree. Okay.
So I guess, assuming everybody's okay with this, well, I guess we'll find out with a vote. But so a motion to receive, I guess, the information from me and to okay or approve the rubric that we're proposing to use. And I'll circulate this again to the group along with the survey, the website link to the survey for everybody to look at. I'll circulate that on Monday or Tuesday for everybody. And yeah, we'll go from there in terms of evaluating 25 Henrietta. And yeah. So I guess, Andrew, you can ask if there's anybody wants to.
Would anyone like to make the motion to receive the rubric and accompanying report? Brian, yes. All in favor? That carries then. And so thank you very much, James. It looks like a very thoughtful approach, and it's going to be fun to get started on this. So I guess the next item is the date of the next meeting.
Yeah,
September 15th, 2023.
Yeah, September 15th. Yes.
Yeah.
Same time. Did this time work okay for everybody? I asked everybody before the meeting, but didn't hear anything from anybody, so I assumed that it was okay, and everybody showed up, so that's good. But okay, great. Yeah, we'll just keep this 2 o'clock, probably the third Friday of every month, and we'll just keep doing this going forward until we're done.
So the date of next meeting. That's the agenda. Other than the only thing that's left is motion to adjourn. Anyone like to make that motion?
Sure.
Robert?
I'd be pleased to.
Pleased to release us all. Thank you, Robert. All in
My
favor?
pleasure.
So I believe we're officially adjourned.
Okay, thanks all, and I'll be in touch Monday, Tuesday, and yeah, have a good weekend.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.